The hours of service regulations were put in place by FMCSA. OOIDA does not in any way endorse, support, or feel that these are the best or most practical ways to protect drivers from excessively long work hours or long-term health problems. Unfortunately, these are the rules that are currently in place. The hours of service regulations are found in Part 395 of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. If you are an interstate commercial driver, you're subject to FMCSA's hours of service regulations. I'm sure you're aware the hours of service regulations have been around for a long time. As a matter of fact, they were originally issued in 1938. And from 1938 to 2004, there were relatively few changes to the hours of service. But in 2004, FMCSA started making changes. And since that time, numerous changes have been proposed. It's your responsibility as a professional truck driver to be compliant with these changes. The hours of service regulations have been around for years, and they really haven't changed a lot over that time. So it's surprising that there are so many people that are confused about the rules and regulations. The thing you need to remember is the hours of service regulations deal in 4 areas that determine the maximum amount of time that you're allowed to drive. First, the number of hours that you drive in a day. Then, the number of hours that you work or you're on duty in a day. Third, the number of hours you can drive based on the number of hours you've been on duty during the past 7 or 8 days. The hours of service regulations also take into consideration the number of hours that you are off duty. And you've got to take into account all 4 of these areas to determine how many hours you're allowed to drive in any given period. So let's take a look at the third area listed above. We're going to be talking about the 60-hour 7-day rule and the 70-hour 8-day rule. The type of operation that you have determines which of these 2 rules applies to you. Let's take a look at some of the facts about the 60 or 70-hour rule. First off, it's not based on a set week. It's not based on a calendar week. It is based on a rolling or floating 7 or 8 day period. For example, if you're operating on a 70-hour 8-day schedule, which most drivers do, the current day would be the newest day of your 8-day period, and the hours you worked 9 days ago would drop out of the calculation. We've been talking about the 60-hour 7-day rule and the 70-hour 8-day rule as if they're the same rule. Actually, they're 2 different rules, and the type of operation you're involved in, that's what determines which one applies to you. FMCSA says if your company or your operation does not operate vehicles every day of the week, you're not allowed to drive after you've been on duty for 60 hours during any 7 consecutive days. Now, what they're saying is if you don't normally operate vehicles every day of the week, that doesn't mean that maybe you just couldn't find a load on Tuesday. What it means is if your schedule does not operate every day of the week, then the 60-hour 7-day rule applies to you. But if you're like most drivers and you operate every day of the week, then the 70-hour 8-day schedule applies to you. And what that means is you're not allowed to drive after you've been on duty 70 hours in any 8 consecutive days. Once you reach that 70-hour on-duty status in any 8 consecutive day period, you can't drive again until you drop below that 70-hour on-duty limit. You can do other work, but you can't do any driving until you get below that limit. Basically, what FMCSA is saying is that they feel that anybody who's been on duty for 60 hours in a 7-day period or more than 70 hours in an 8-day period is just too fatigued to drive safely. It doesn't matter how you feel physically or how you feel about this regulation. This is the rule that we have in place, and FMCSA takes it seriously. And I also want to make a note here. This rule takes precedence over the 11-hour driving limit. Once you reach the 60-hour or 70-hour limit, you're done driving, period. It doesn't matter how many hours you have left on your 11-hour limit. Now let's take a look at some examples so you can better understand how these rules work. Because most drivers operate under the 70-hour 8-day rule, that's the one that we're going to use for our examples. Just keep in mind, if the 60-hour 7-day rule applies to you, you figure it in the exact same way. Keeping a recap chart is probably the easiest way for you to keep track of how many hours you've got in any 8-day period. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. It doesn't need to be anything printed. It could be a scrap piece of paper. It could be a spiral binder. But what you need is a chart where you can keep track of how many hours you've driven, how many hours you spent on duty non-driving, and of course what your total on-duty hours per day is. Now, I know you've got a logbook to keep track of your daily activities, but if you want to stay compliant with the 70-hour, 8-day portion of the hours of service regulations, you need to have a place where you can keep track of your total on-duty hours in any 8 consecutive day period. All right, let's take a look at how a driver would use the recap chart. At the top, you can see our logbook grid, and at the bottom, you can see our recap chart. And remember, we're going to be looking at an 8 consecutive day period as it applies to the 70-hour 8-day rule. Our driver's just completing his 34-hour restart on Sunday at midnight, and so he is off duty for 24 hours. Since our driver logged 0 hours on duty, he still has 70 hours available in this 8-day period. Now on Monday, our driver logs on duty at 5 a.m. At 6 a.m., he starts driving for 7 hours. He spends an hour in the sleeper berth, and then he comes back on duty for 2 hours, one of which he's driving. So at the end of our day, he's got 8 hours on-duty driving time and 2 hours on-duty non-driving time for a total of 10 on-duty hours, which also gives him a total of 10 on-duty hours for this 8 consecutive day period. As you can see from our driver's logbook on Tuesday, he logged on duty at 7 a.m., and from 7 a.m. to 4:30 a.m. he was on duty with the exception of 1 hour, which he logged off duty from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock. So he had a total of 7 hours of driving time, 1.5 hours of on-duty non-driving time for a total of 8.5 hours for the day, giving him a total of 18.5 hours on duty during this 8-day period. That leaves him a total of 51.5 hours in which he can drive during this 8-day period. The following day, our driver's logbook shows that he again logged on duty at 7 a.m. He was on duty till 8:30 p.m. with the exception of 1 hour from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock off duty. The log shows that he spent 8.5 hours on duty driving and 4 hours on duty non-driving. That gave him a total of 12.5 hours on duty for this day. So during this 8 consecutive day period, he has logged 31 hours on duty, leaving 39 hours in which he can drive. Looks like our driver decided to sleep in on Thursday. He didn't log on duty till 8 a.m. and he was on duty till 6 p.m. with the exception of 1 hour between 2 and 3 p.m. which he was off duty. So for the day, he logged 7 hours on-duty driving, 2 hours on-duty non-driving for a total of 9 on-duty hours for Thursday. For the 8 consecutive day period, he's logged a total of 40 hours on duty, leaving only 30 hours in which he can drive during this period. Whether our driver realizes it or not, the number of hours available for driving during this 8 consecutive day period are becoming very limited. The next day, our driver was on duty from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. For Friday, our driver logged 8 hours on-duty driving and 2 hours on-duty non-driving for a total of 10 on-duty hours. He's now logged 50 hours on duty, leaving him only 20 on-duty hours in which he can drive for the next 2 days. From 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. on Saturday, our driver was on duty, logging 8 hours driving and 4 hours on duty non-driving. So Saturday, our driver logged a total of 12 hours on duty. He's now logged 62 hours on duty this period, leaving him only 8 hours in which he can drive on Sunday. As we just mentioned, our driver only has 8 hours in which he can drive on Sunday. Of course, he's still going to have to meet his 10 consecutive hours off duty requirement. But once he hits that 70 hours on duty in this 8-day period, he can no longer drive. As you can see from the driver's log, on Sunday he only spent 5 hours on duty, 4 of which were driving. This brings his total on-duty hours for this 8 consecutive day period to 67. As you can see from this recap chart, our driver has been in compliance with all of the hours of service rules and regulations since his 34-hour restart 8 days ago. But if you'll take a close look at the recap chart, you'll notice that our driver has painted himself into a corner. Remember, the 70-hour 8-day rule is based on a rolling or floating 8-day period. So in this case, Monday would be the newest or current day, and the hours from 9 days ago would drop out of the calculation. The problem is, 9 days ago our driver didn't log any on-duty hours. So he still has 67 on-duty hours for the current 8 consecutive day period, leaving only 3 hours in which he can drive on this day. On this Monday, our driver only drove 2 hours and was on duty non-driving for 6 hours. Can you see the violation? Our driver's 70 hours on duty time in which he can drive ran out at 1 p.m. When he got behind the wheel and drove from 3 to 4, he became non-compliant with the hours of service regulations. That 1 hour of driving that was just 2 hours beyond the 70-hour on-duty limit could cost our driver to be put out of service and be fined a maximum of anywhere between $1,000 and $11,000. The 8 on-duty hours that our driver logged today brings his total on-duty hours for this 8 consecutive day period to 75 hours. Now, the 75 hours isn't the problem. Remember, you can work as many hours as you want. You just can't drive beyond the 70-hour mark. And that 1 hour that he drove, which was beyond the 70-hour mark, put him out of compliance. And this is the part of the hours of service regulation that so many drivers get caught on. They spend so much time focusing on how many hours they're driving in a day that they forget about this portion of the regulations. Remember, once you've crossed that 70 hours on duty in any 8 consecutive day period, you cannot drive. If you do, you're violating the hours of service regulations. Assuming our driver hasn't been put out of service, let's look at how he's going to handle this day. As we roll our 8 consecutive day period forward, Tuesday becomes our newest or current day, and the hours from 9 days ago drop out of our current calculation. So we get to drop 10 hours from our on-duty time. As we recalculate our on-duty hours during the current 8 consecutive day period, we show 65 hours on duty. At this point, we can only drive during the first 5 on-duty hours of this day. As you can see, our driver only logged 2 hours driving on this day, both before the 70-hour limit expired. He did log another 6 hours non-driving on-duty time, which brought his total to 8 hours on duty for the day. This gives him a grand total of 73 on-duty hours during this 8 consecutive day period. Remember, you can work as many hours as you want. You just can't drive once you've reached the 70-hour threshold. So there is no violation of the hours of service regulation at this point. Now, it may appear that our driver got away with violating the hours of service regulations when he drove beyond the 70-hour period 2 days ago, but that just may be an illusion. If he gets pulled over and they do an audit of his logbooks, the officer could spot the violation and still fine him. So let's just take a minute and talk about what the penalties for violating hours of service rules are. A driver could be put out of service right there on the roadside until he's accumulated enough off-duty time to be back in compliance. Both state and local law enforcement officials can assess fines. FMCSA can level a civil penalty on a driver or a carrier, and that penalty could be anywhere from $1,000 to $11,000 per violation, depending on the severity. Your CSA score could be downgraded, and if they can prove that you intentionally violate the hours of service regulations, federal criminal penalties could be brought against you. Remember, the hours of service regulations were put in place by FMCSA. OOIDA does not in any way endorse, support, or feel that these are the best or most practical ways to protect drivers from excessively long work hours or long-term health problems. Unfortunately, these are the rules that are currently in place. If you're a professional truck driver, it's your responsibility to know and obey these regulations. If you haven't already done it, you can look up these regulations, and you need to study them. They're in the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, and they're under Part 395. If you've studied these regulations and you still have questions, you can call OOIDA at 1-800-444-5791 and ask for the Compliance Department, and one of our compliance reps will be glad to talk over any of these regulations with you. We hope you found this program useful, and you can find additional online educational offerings by visiting ooidafoundation.org. We hope to see you online again soon. Until we meet again, remember, OOIDA is the only organization out there fighting for the rights of all truckers. Please join us in this cause by becoming a member. Call OOIDA's membership department at 1-800-444-5791.